Hi, welcome to Theology Therapist. I'm Hannah, and today we're going to talk about the damaging effects of purity culture, so stick around. Purity culture is essentially abstinence-only sex education within religious context. This not only applies to sex education, but it also encompasses gender and sexuality roles and expectations. It also dictates someone's access to God, essentially. Within purity culture, someone's spirituality is directly and intricately connected to their sexuality. The term purity culture is generally associated with the white American evangelical Christian purity movement launched in the early 1990s. The concept is found in other religious communities that restrict and control sexuality and gender expression, but likely under different names like worthiness or honor culture. Emily Joy Allison, she is a researcher and author of the book #Church2, and she says, it's mandatory to have complete and total sexual abstinence until legal monogamous marriage between a cisgender heterosexual man and a cisgender heterosexual woman for life or else. And that is her definition of purity culture. I think it's a really great working definition because it encompasses so many different aspects that purity culture impacts and touches on. Some of those high points are going to be: one, sexual education, so abstinence only, what is acceptable, and within which context it is acceptable, so legal monogamous marriage, and then for whom this is appropriate: cisgender heterosexual men and women. So here we have gender and sexuality assumptions or expectations. I think the really key piece of this definition of purity culture is these 4 words at the very end: for life or else. And that's because in purity culture, the stakes are extremely high. There are consequences for your actions within this framework, and we're going to get into that. Today we're going to talk about the damaging effects of purity culture because there's a whole generation of people. You can find news articles on this and research articles. There's a whole generation of people who were raised in evangelical or fundamentalist or high control, high demand religious contexts. Oftentimes these contexts are, like I said, evangelical. It might be Catholic. It might look like Jehovah's Witness, Mormon, Muslim, Amish, definitely within cult communities. And so the purpose today is to talk about, for this whole generation of people, why purity culture and how purity culture is so damaging. Like I said before, the working definition that I'm using, that I'm going off of, and I would like to propose that we both use, is the one that Emily Joy Allison uses and proposes, which is: purity culture is the spiritual corollary of rape culture, created in Christian environments by theologies that teach complete sexual abstinence until legal monogamous marriage between a cisgender heterosexual man and a cisgender heterosexual woman for life or else. So the Christian purity movement began as a response to birth control and abortion activism in the 1970s. It gained further steam as it became a reaction to the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. It often characterizes young men, but men at large, as out of control sexual beings. Like if they're presented with any type of temptation, then they're not able to control themselves and they're going to act on those impulses. So it really portrays men as out of control, and it sets them up for the expectation or the thinking, the mindset of how their actions, like they're not in control of their actions, and so other people are responsible for what they're doing. This would be a topic for a separate video. This is how that rape culture that Emily Joy Allison mentions at the very beginning, where that comes from, where that begins to be cultivated. Purity culture within these, I'm gonna just go religious at large, within these religious communities, often characterizes young women, or women at large, as the gatekeepers of sex without any urges or desires of their own. Then there is the commodification of the female body as sexual property of either the father or the husband. Now, a really great example of this is not even the marriage ceremony where there's the giving away of the bride. Not even that, although it is, but is the true love waits ceremonies that were so popular and so rampant in the late 90s and the 2000s. So these ceremonies would be large gatherings of teens with their parents and the religious leaders, maybe the youth group leader, whoever that was. And in that ceremony, they would reinforce purity culture, abstinence only with cisgender, heterosexual men and women, for life or else. And the teens would then make a commitment in front of their peers and their parents to remain abstinent, to not have sex or any sexual interactions until they are married. And so what often happens during that ceremony is that the parents, the dad or the mom, will give a ring, a true love waits ring, a purity ring, to the teen. And they'll put the ring on their ring finger, which is in the US and in most Western communities, their cultures, that's their wedding finger. And so there's this like weird exchange, I would say, between the parents and the teen, where that teen is essentially pledging to their parents before God that they're going to remain abstinent and not have sex. So whenever there is a marriage or a change in the teens or who grows into adulthood's life, it can be an uncomfortable situation to navigate, reality to navigate, if you've made this commitment in front of all these people or your parents, and then you have to decide whether or not you keep the ring on. Within these communities and contexts, the ring gets replaced with the marriage ban, the wedding ban. And so there is that commodification of the female body as property of the husband or the father. That becomes really problematic for an individual. For purity culture, let me just say this, is just as damaging for men as it is for women. And it is just as or even more damaging for queer, non-binary, trans folk. So this is problematic. Someone assumes the role of like owner, property of another. If this other person then subjugates any of their desires or needs or wishes because they're under the rule or household of this other person. We can see in any of the articles that are coming up that are news articles or blogs, books, research articles, we can see how problematic and damaging this dynamic is. The intention behind purity culture, let's just like give it the benefit of the doubt here, is to reduce the incidence of teen sexual activity and to delay or reduce the unwanted or negative effects of sexual activity. Most often that would have been for women, even as late as the 1980s and the 1970s. There are the theological implications of purity culture, which are really one of, as you might assume, one of purity. So keeping yourself pure to be pure before God. So the intention behind purity culture is one of, similar to other religious outside of Christianity, you can find this type of guideline or rule or rhetoric in Buddhism and Judaism, in lots of other religious contexts, religious texts, setting out the expectation that a religious person would not engage in sexual activity that is not necessary. Because historically, to move up the ranks in religiosity, you were reducing the needs or the desires of the body, which is also a video for another time because we are humans and we live in a body, and so that doesn't really work. The ways in which we see that doesn't work in a modern context and within the context of purity culture and how it can be so damaging is that adolescents or teens actually choose riskier sexual behaviors in order to avoid having vaginal penile intercourse, right? Because in this context, that is what's considered sex. And that is what you have to keep yourself from in order to be in good standing. So teens will actually, and young adults will actually choose riskier sexual behaviors like unprotected sex or having anal sex because they are wanting to avoid the perceived spiritual or communal consequences of not being abstinent until legal monogamous marriage. There are higher rates of teen pregnancy and there are higher rates of sexually transmitted infections. And there's really no knowledge of consent or a discussion around saying no. Because if you think back to just the definition of purity culture, it's like men are characterized to be these out of control animals and women are the gatekeepers of sex and don't have any sexual desires or urges of their own. And under this context, like, why would you need to talk about consent? Why would you need to talk about consent when women are in a marriage? It's assumed that everything goes and that you're not having sex outside of the context of marriage. So there's no need to talk about consent. So when I grew up, I was raised in purity culture and I wasn't given, like, there was no discussion on consent. And I think one of the ways that really impacted me was not understanding, as I rejected purity culture, I left that community, really not understanding how to say no. And I know that sounds so crazy because it sounds crazy to me now, but when you are sexually intimate with someone, those are extremely vulnerable situations. You're in this extremely vulnerable situation and you're like, oh my God, how do I tell somebody no, wait, stop, or hold on, or can we do this or that, or actually I don't want to do this, or no, put a condom on. It can be really difficult if you were not given the language around that, and if you're not given the framework to even know that's a thing, even though outside of that framework, it might sound so crazy. Of course you have to do that. It's really hard. So I want to use that as a bridge into talking about the impact of purity culture on individuals and on society as a whole. In the article Decolonizing Purity Culture, Gendered Racism and White Idealization in Evangelical Christianity, the authors say, espousing white norms of femininity, purity, and marriage, thereby the impact of shaming women of color for sexual urges and their natural bodies was inseparable from colonial origins, which first imposed Eurocentric ideals of the female body and concepts of purity through the gaze of white colonizers who made no attempt to understand the cultural norms and practices of the groups they sought to colonize. And that white women could seemingly explore their sexuality, experiment with promiscuity, and still maintain their image of purity and standing within their religious community, but that was not offered or available to women of color. I think that this is a really important discussion when we talk about purity culture because there's a lot of research around the impact of purity culture, and it's typically done within a white evangelical context, when in reality, purity politics and purity theology impacts so many people. And what gets the most airtime is what has impacted white evangelical groups. I think it's important to just pause and look at even the cultural implications of purity culture, that when this is laid on top of a separate culture that doesn't have the same ideals of purity, this can be even more complicated and jarring. This can be even more damaging. People of color, and even more specifically women of color, have been significantly negatively impacted by purity culture because they were navigating their own culture and purity culture at the same time, which were at odds with each other. The study also highlights how there is a tendency to think of or highlight white women as the ideal pure woman. There is this conflation of purity and whiteness, which in effect equates Black women as the exact opposite of purity and the ideal purity standard. This is so damaging because of how it impacts relationships to yourself if you're a person of color or a woman of color, and romantic relationships. If you are dating someone who is of a different race or ethnic background or cultural background than you are, and you exist within a purity culture community, it is always going to involve beliefs about race and ethnicity and culture. Purity culture has been shown time and again in research studies to increase sexual dysfunction in men and women. I mentioned before that purity culture and abstinence-only education increases the rates of teen pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, but one of the things that I didn't mention yet is that it also increases the rates of gynecological cancer that are actually preventable. And so you might be like, what the heck is that? I think there's now the HPV vaccine, and so most people who exist within the purity culture community or culture are not going to get the HPV vaccine, because remember, why would you need that if you were not having sex before marriage? But what we know statistically is that teens and then adults do not wait to have sex until they're married. And that's why this is problematic, is because it is a human experience. It is a human nature to engage in sexual activity and be sexually intimate with someone. You are asking someone to deny their humanness, and that's going to produce a lot of negative effects, because you're asking a teen to go against their human nature, their natural human development, with the teen's general impulsivity and thinking capacity that is really normal and natural when you're a teen. So, like I mentioned a second ago, sexual dysfunction in men, in purity culture context, men can experience erectile dysfunction, but women experience something called vaginismus. Sex therapist Dr. Misty Smith, she says that vaginismus is a physical tightening of the pelvic floor that can be triggered by a psychological reaction to being taught to withhold sexuality and the use of shame to urge against women having sex before marriage. And I've actually seen clients in my private practice who are experiencing, they're diagnosed with this. At the same time that it's a relief because there is treatment, it can be really confusing and upsetting to try to figure out, like, what the heck is going on with you and why is sex so painful? Southern states, where they have the highest concentration of evangelicalism, top the U.S. Center for Disease Control's 2020 list for the highest rates of chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis in a 2016 University of Massachusetts at Amherst study. It found that of the more than 3,000 women who were in the study and who pledged their virginity in adolescence, they were more likely to be taught that condoms and birth control were ineffective in preventing pregnancy and STIs, and that a failure to remain a virgin until marriage was a moral failure. This is my specialization and what I see clients for, and so I see clients in my practice all the time, and I have people DMing me on social media and emailing me, sharing their stories with me about how this happened to them, how purity culture made them believe that kissing their boyfriend as a teen was a moral failure. So they had to marry that boyfriend. Otherwise, it was sinful. Other people have emailed me saying, I am dating somebody and I'm not attracted to them, but it's not them. I think it's actually something in me. Or when clients have come and talked to me about how they are dating someone, they really like them, and that the person that they're dating asks and invites them into adding a sexual component to their dating relationship, and the automatic immediate reaction is to shut it down. I've had people DM me on Instagram and say, I'm just getting out of a divorce, I'm just leaving my marriage, and I was married for this many years to someone that I was told I had to marry. Now I'm in my 30s, my 40s, and I feel like I'm a teenager again, and I have to figure out my body, dating, relationships. I have to figure this all out again, and I'm behind. Purity culture impacts you in real, true, lived ways. It isn't just a theology that you learn in church. It is a theology that is indoctrinated into you, and long after your mind rejects it, your body is still responds to it. A couple of things that you can do if you are looking for resources. scarletteen.com is a resource specifically for adolescents in sex education and getting support for sex ed and relationships for teens and emerging adults. The other place where you can look is called OWL, OWL, which stands for Our Whole Lives. And it is a comprehensive sex education program that you can often find at Unitarian Universalist churches or United Church of Christ churches. You can often find those programs and curriculums happening in those spaces. If you are recovering from purity culture and you're like, what do I do? The first thing I would say is educate yourself. Get comprehensive sex education, learn anatomy, your own body and the body of the person that you're dating. Then I really recommend having a diverse friend group. That might be surprising to you, but when you're coming out of purity culture, it's like everything is the same. It can feel really jarring to have different opinions and make different choices. And if you have a diverse friend group, that is going to make things easier. You can also find deconstruction and post-purity culture groups on the internet. I know they're here on YouTube, they're on Instagram, TikTok. I'm sure they're on Reddit. If you enjoy consuming content and being in virtual spaces, that is a great way to do that. Reclamation Collective, they also offer support groups. No, if you're interested, I have a free personality quiz that you can take to find out what your post-purity culture personality is. I am a lover of personality quizzes, so this is super fun for me to put together. There is the link below in the description, and I hope that you like it just as much. If you do, feel free to reach out to me and let me know your thoughts. That is all for today. I'm so happy that you are here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and subscribe with bell notifications so that you can stay up to date on all upcoming content. And remember to go ahead down in the description and take that post-purity culture personality quiz. Be well. I'll see you next time, friends.